basically. You can access this at any of the stages. The first one would be to just simply put the hands behind you. The knees, they don't have to be squeezed together. They can be a little bit apart. And then push up into your hips. And I'm going to hold that for about 5 breaths. And then I'll come down. And then I'm going to bring my elbows down. So I'm now increasing the amount of pressure that's going to show up in the front of my hips. I'll push up there. If for some reason you have trouble going back to your elbows, you can just stay on your hands and do it there. And this next one, I'm going to tuck my toes under. And what this does is it actually elevates my pelvis into a position where I'm going to put more pressure into the tissues in the front of my legs. You could go hands here. If you have enough flexibility, you can go to your elbows. And then one more time, press your hips up into the air and then release. I'll just straighten out my legs for a moment. And now I'm going to do a back bend again.
I'm now going to overlay the first back bend with the second back bend. Pay attention to the angle of the femur as the first one, and then as the second one comes in, and the difference in height between the two. And all of this just from those few simple preps.
So just do this as a little experiment, just to pay attention once again to how much interference you run into in your back bend from the tissues in the front of your pelvis. Breathing is almost obviously fundamental to life. It only takes about 3 minutes without oxygen, then we're pretty much gone. They could, of course, go longer if they've trained themselves or if they're revived after perhaps 10 minutes, depending on conditions. But basically 3 minutes and life ends. And what takes the brunt of the lack of oxygen is the nervous system, particularly the brain. Having said that, enough can't be said for finding proper breathing, both in daily life as well as in the yoga practice. So I can also imagine some ancient yogis in the distant past being in some kind of situation where they observe somebody who has not been able to breathe and probably dies. And as a result, there's this sort of intimate connection between breath and life force. And if we look at breath, what comes in with that breath is simply oxygen. Remember, molecules. Sometimes we just say the word oxygen and we don't really connect to what that specifically means, but basically 2 molecules of oxygen joined together. We're already getting really subtle. And so what is behind that oxygen doing what it does and how it feeds our body and nourishes our tissues is, in a sense, prana, is life force. So oxygen and prana are not the same thing, but on the continuum, oxygen is just slightly more gross than the very subtle prana. So let's look at the actual act of breathing and what happens. Now, the main muscle of respiration is the diaphragm. The diaphragm is unlike any other muscle in that one is its shape, and 2, its thickness. It's actually only about 1/8 of an inch thick, extremely thin. The other aspect that's interesting about it is that it doesn't attach from one bone to another bone and then move those 2 bones in relationship to one another. Instead, the diaphragm attaches onto itself. Let me show you. The diaphragm is circular in nature, and it runs and attaches onto the xiphoid process here at the bottom of the sternum, along the line of the rib cage, back here to these floating ribs, back onto the spine, around to these floating ribs, and then back up the front of the rib cage. So the first attachment is quite circular. And then the fibers move upward from here and create a dome shape up here inside the rib cage. It's almost like opening an umbrella underneath the rib cage. And as you'll see, we have an image here that shows the rib cage, the diaphragm. You'll see it through the rib cage there, and then the abdominal muscles beneath that. So from this circular attachment up until the top of the dome, and the top of the dome is called the central tendon. And so the fiber direction is upward until it attaches onto this common central tendon. And so when we breathe, the top of the diaphragm, that central tendon, actually drops down. Now, sitting on top of the diaphragm is the heart and the lungs. And of course, the heart and the lungs are surrounded by connective tissue. And of course, the diaphragm itself, being tendinous in nature in that area, is also connective tissue. And so the connective tissue of the diaphragm actually is connected to the connective tissue that's around the lungs. So when that diaphragm drops, it actually pulls on those bags. And as a result of pulling on those bags, there's a negative pressure created inside your chest. And so the air outside is of a higher pressure, and so air is forced into your mouth or your nose, depending on how you like to breathe. It is also possible to change the direction of breath. And this is where we get this little overlap of functionality with Mula Bandha and Uddiyana Bandha. Mula Bandha is defined as the root lock or valve, and Uddiyana Bandha is the upward flying valve. And these are two concepts that are aligned with energy and therefore also connected to breath, because through the breath comes the energy. While looking at this entire structure, and again, if you look at the image on the screen, you'll see that basically what we create is a tissue container. The diaphragm above, the abdominal muscles around the sides and the front, and the pelvic floor muscles fill in this space underneath. And so if we change the shape of this container, it affects the way in which the diaphragm functions. So imagine this for a moment. If we take a nice, full, deep inhalation in, our abdomen will naturally move outward as a result of the downward pressure from the diaphragm, pushing down on the abdominal contents, and then it follows the path of least resistance, which is out through the abdomen. At the same time that it's doing that, it's also putting pressure downward on the pelvic floor. And so the most gross way of engaging Mula Bandha is to contract the pelvic floor muscles. Now, I just want to mention that the pelvic floor muscles themselves are not Mula Bandha. They just stimulate the Mula Bandha. In the same way that Uddiyana Bandha, although we draw our abdomen completely in to make the Uddiyana Bandha, it's not the actual drawing in of the abdomen, it's what's stimulated by drawing the abdomen in. So, if we look at the intention of Mula Bandha, it is to prevent the downward movement of energy from it escaping out through our torso. And so if we contract our pelvic floor, when we breathe, that inhalation, the pressure from the diaphragm comes down, but it no longer goes down and out through the pelvic floor. If we also hold in our abdomen, then we once again change how pressure and force move from the diaphragm's inhalation. And a very interesting thing happens here. When the abdomen is drawn in, or when you tighten your abdominal muscles, as the diaphragm contracts, because its fibers are upward, or basically vertical in nature, and it attaches to these ribs, the top of the diaphragm doesn't move now. Instead, the contraction of the diaphragm actually lifts the rib cage up. And so if you think of the intention of Uddiyana Bandha, it's to make the energy move upward. So on an inhalation with the navel drawn in, the breath ends up lifting right up into the chest and through the ribs, which is the exact idea of Uddiyana Bandha. So I'm going to do a little bit of breathing. You just stay focused on abdomen and chest. And in the first breath, what I'm going to do is let my abdomen fall out, but keep an eye also on the chest and how little or how much it moves. Okay, now this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold my navel in and contract the pelvic floor as well, and watch for chest and abdominal movements. an obvious difference. Let's do just a simple breathing exercise. All we're going to do is meter our breath, a simple count of 3 for an inhalation and exhalation, and then we'll take it up through 4, 5, and then a count of 6 for inhalation and exhalation. And breathing is one of the best ways to increase your lung capacity. By focusing and controlling on your breath and playing with the edges of your inhalation, you're actually going to stretch the tissues that will restrict your breathing, particularly those tissues that live between the ribs.
This is a simple breathing exercise where we count the length of inhalation and exhalation. And then we increase the length of inhalation and exhalation over time. Inhale, 2, 3, exhale, 2, 3, inhale, 2, 3, exhale, 2. You can place your hands over your ears and listen to the sound of your breath from the inside. Exhale, 2, 3, inhale. Listen for fluctuations in your breath. 3, exhale. Try to make it as smooth and controlled as possible. 3, take it to 4. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4, inhale, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4. Take it to 5. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5.
It's also nice to just plug your ears, cover your ears, or press this little part on your ear while you're doing your inhalations and exhalations, so you can really listen from the inside to the quality and sound of your breath. And you'll notice where it gets stuck, whether or not the breath flutters, how much stress or even strain there is at the top or bottom of inhalation and exhalation. All right, let's make our way to the shoulder and the arm. The first thing I want to do is actually do a comparison for you. When we covered the foot, we found that there were actually 14 phalanges, which make our toes. In the hand, we also have 14 phalanges, which make up our fingers. And then we've got this row of 5 bones called the metatarsals. And in the hand, they're called metacarpals. And then we have this group of 7 tarsal bones, which match up with the 8 carpal bones. So when we did the foot, we said there were 26 bones in the foot. There are 27 bones in the hand. As we make our way up, here in the foot, we have an ankle joint that does basically a flexion and extension, and an abduction, adduction, a sideways movement. Same thing here in the hand, flexion and extension. Let me put it here. A flexion and extension, and an abduction and adduction. And then, of course, we've got these 2 bones that make up the forearm, and 2 bones that make up the foreleg. The knee joint flexes and extends, and we also learn that it rotates once it's bent to 10 degrees or more. The same is also true here at the elbow joint. It does flexion and extension, and with an additional joint, it does rotation, which we call pronation and supination of the hand. And then we've got this long bone called the humerus. Here we have the long bone called the femur. We have a ball and socket joint, which does flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and all the rotation we want. Here at the end of the humerus, we've got another ball and socket joint, where we do flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and rotation internally and externally. We can even take it a step further. Look at the pelvis and the scapula, both somewhat flat, broad bones. Pubic bone on the pelvis is not so dissimilar from the clavicle or collarbone. So the arm, like the leg, is also a kinetic chain. There's a relationship between wrist, elbow, and shoulder joint. There's a little bit of a change because unlike the lower half, we have the collarbone or clavicle attaching to the sternum, which is a little bit different than the two pubic bones coming together. And of course in the pelvis we have the sacroiliac joint where the pelvis meets the sacrum, but of course we don't have that here. Instead, the scapula isn't attached to anything. It's just held in place by the soft tissues of the body on the back. In the ball and socket joint of the femur, we have a very deep depression holding the head of the femur, and we give that up here in the shoulder joint. We have a relatively flat depression for the head of the humerus to sit in. And the reason why this is to allow for a larger range of motion. If you think about hip joint movement, forward and backwards and around is nothing compared to what we get in the shoulder joint. Let's look at the movements of each of the three bones that make up the shoulder girdle. First we have our clavicle or collarbone, which does what we call elevation, depression, protraction, retraction, and then it also rotates forward and backward. If you use one of your hands to find this bony pointy bit on the top of your clavicle near the center, and you rotate your arm as if it's going behind your back, and then bring it all the way up and reach back this way, you'll feel that point dip forward and dip back. Let's look now at the scapula. And there's a common idea about the scapula, and that is that it sits quite flat on the back. But of course this isn't the reality. If we look at the skeleton, we'll actually see that the scapula is sitting at an angle. You see the humerus is actually sitting more forward than it is to the side. This is important to understand its placement and its function. So the movements of the scapula, and there's commonly 6 movements of the scapula. The first one is elevation, where it moves upwards, like shrugging your shoulders. And then depression is bringing it back down. And then we have protraction, which brings the scapula forward. Retraction, which brings it back. And then we have what we call upward and downward rotation. In upward rotation, the scapula points upward, or you could look at this bottom angle as it moves outward. In downward rotation, the opposite happens. So here's what this looks like if I were to do it in my own body. This is all abduction of the shoulder joint. Everything beyond this, so if I reach across to try to touch my opposite ear, that's upward rotation of the scapula. If I bring my hand down and I bring it behind my back, my scapula is rotating downward. There are actually a couple of other movements that you don't normally find in anatomy books, and they're kind of combinations of different movements. And they are a tilting that happens. And so the scapula can actually ride up and tilt slightly, where this bottom edge actually comes off of the rib cage. And then the second one is a tilting where this edge of the scapula actually lifts off of the rib cage. You get this tilting as well. And we'll talk about this a little bit more specifically because this does show up in our yoga practice. So now let's look specifically at movements in the actual shoulder joint, which is where the humerus meets the scapula. So the name of this joint is the glenohumeral joint. And if you remember our little equation from the first DVD, bone plus O plus bone equals the joint name, this area is called the glenoid fossa. And so we put gleno and humerus together, glenohumeral joint. Movements at this joint are flexion of the shoulder, extension of the shoulder, and either further or hyperextension of the shoulder joint. And then we do abduction and adduction of the shoulder joint. And I'll just bend my elbow so you can see it a little bit more clearly. Internal rotation and external rotation. And just like in the leg, inward, internal, and medial all mean the same thing. The opposite, outward, external, and lateral also mean the same thing. When we combine the movements of all of these structures together, and keep in mind that the arm is basically designed to put the hand in any position. So if I reach my arm out to the side and palm up, in this case, I can rotate. If I bring my shoulder forward and the scapula forward, I end up with palm up one more time. In order to accommodate a joint that has to be as flexible as the shoulder joint is, and at the same time maintain a certain amount of strength and stability, what has developed is a group of muscles called the rotator cuff. And they're named the rotator cuff group of muscles because of the way in which their tendinous attachments latch on to the head of the humerus. There are 4 muscles that make up the rotator cuff group of muscles. And the first one is a muscle called supraspinatus. So here's a scapula. If I put it in this position, there's this ridge on the back of the scapula known as the spine of the scapula. And supraspinatus literally means, supra means above, spinatus refers to the spine of the scapula. And so the supraspinatus muscle actually fills in a space above the spine of the scapula, goes underneath the clavicle, and underneath this end of the clavicle, and comes out, here's the tendon here, and attaches to the very outside of the head of the humerus. This is actually the most commonly torn rotator cuff muscle. Its action is to initiate abduction of the shoulder, which looks like this. And so if somebody has torn the supraspinatus muscle in their rotator cuff, they won't be able to lift their arm up to the side. They'll often do something like this. The second muscle in the rotator cuff group is a muscle called the infraspinatus, which is just about all of this material. And like the supraspinatus, it's named based on its location. Infra now means below, like inferior. And so the infraspinatus fills what's called the infraspinous fossa, and the fibers head to the back of the head of the humerus. And so infraspinatus does external or outward rotation of the shoulder joint. It's matched with a smaller muscle, which is mostly hidden in this model, but just this little line below here is a little muscle called teres minor. And teres minor attaches to just about the same place that infraspinatus does, and is also an outward or external rotator of the shoulder joint. And then to finish it up, the last of the rotator cuff group of muscles is a muscle called subscapularis. Sub means under. So subscapularis lives underneath the scapula and fills what's called the subscapular fossa. The subscapularis runs to the front of the head of the humerus, and it does internal rotation of the humerus. So now we have effectively surrounded the head of the humerus, one in the front, one on top, and 2 attachments in the back. And if you look at this in real life, not on this model, what you find is there is a common connective tissue tendinous attachment to the rotator cuff group of muscles. When you look at the actual shape of the bones and the joint, you'll see that because it's round, it's always really rotation. Even abduction is, in essence, a rotation. And so what's more important about this group is that they create a dynamic way to stabilize the shoulder joint through movement. Where in the hip joint, you've got the deep socket, the very thick ligaments around it, and therefore is more restrictive to range of motion. And then separate from that, you've got the tissues that surround the hip joint to allow for and restrict movement. Here, because it's muscle, it allows for that much more movement and rotation. And as you saw, just about 360 degrees of rotation in the arm is possible. Now, as a result of it doing these stabilizing as well as movement functions, the rotator cuff group of muscles tends to get into trouble. As I've said, the supraspinatus most commonly torn. The second most common is probably infraspinatus. Over a period of time, if the body is not slowly accommodated to doing this amount of movement, you get tension and tightness in these muscles, and it often feeds generalized pain in the shoulder. So let's make our way down to the elbow joint, which is sitting in the middle of the wrist and the shoulder, the same way that the knee sits between the ankle and the hip joint. And we're going to use this when we get into the practical section to shift the position of our shoulder and our scapula. We don't normally see too many problems around the elbow. Golfers and tennis players may end up with golfer's elbow or tennis elbow, both of which are essentially inflammation of the tendons that attach on the inside or outside of the elbow. Beyond that, very common condition at the wrist is what's called carpal tunnel syndrome. And carpal tunnel syndrome is a fairly defined thing, and basically it's a compression of the nerve that feeds the thumb side of the hand. So if I place my finger over this area of the carpal bones, there would normally be a tendon that would replace my finger. And through that little tunnel, the carpal tunnel, runs all of the tendons that move the fingers and the hand. And all of those muscles are located here on the forearm. And if you were to just wrap your hand around your forearm and wiggle your fingers around a little bit, you'll feel the contraction of all of those tissues. So as it runs through the carpal tunnel, these are all fairly tightly packed. And when you do a repetitive motion, whether it's gripping or grasping or pulling with your hand or even typing on a keyboard, these muscles tend to get overly tight. And as a result, they swell. And so does the tendons as they pass through the carpal tunnel. And when that happens, it compresses the median nerve that runs through that tunnel as well, creating pain, tingling, or numbness on the thumb side of the hand. If you have pain, tingling, numbness on the pinky side of your hand, you still could have a nerve problem. However, it's not going to be carpal tunnel syndrome. If somebody's in a very acute phase of carpal tunnel syndrome, they probably won't show up to a yoga class. But if they do, there's a number of things that I've found helpful in determining if it's going to be more helpful or harmful at that stage. And again, you have to treat everybody as an individual. The information I'm going to give you here is just very generalized. Depending on how long they've had this condition, it may reduce the likelihood of it correcting itself, or perhaps of how much benefit doing yoga will have on it. If they're very close, if the symptoms have just started showing up, it's actually more likely that stretching and yoga and perhaps even massage therapy will actually benefit and help these people. But what these people generally cannot do is to put pressure on that area of their hand, right where that carpal tunnel is. So here's a very simple thing you can do if somebody comes into your class complaining of carpal tunnel syndrome. One, I don't recommend a lot of weight bearing in the hands, so you may adjust their sequence of poses to avoid some of that stuff. But if they're going to do it, and some may be quite happy to do this, and you can either use a second mat, or you can actually fold or curve over their existing mat and place the hands there. You put a little bit more weight as a result into this part of the hand, and at the same time you'll reduce the actual angle of the wrist by elevating the heel of the hand. This can also be accomplished by buying the little wedges that they sell that are made out of the same material that you would get a yoga block. Place that on the floor, and again it elevates the heel of the hand and reduces the angle of the wrist itself. So let's look again at the comparison between the arm and the leg. And what we're going to talk about are basically the muscles and how similar the lower limb and the upper limb are. So if I put the arm into a position similar to the leg, hand, foot, lower leg, lower arm, etc. On the front of the femur, we had the quadriceps group of muscles, right? 4 muscles that basically go across the knee and are dedicated to straightening that knee. Well, on the arm, on the back of the arm, we have the triceps muscle. Instead of a group of 4 quadriceps, we have a group of 3 triceps, which one of which does attach onto the pelvis of the upper body, the scapula, and the rest attach on the humerus itself. And then they all attach onto this part, which is similar to the kneecap, called the olecranon process. And they're dedicated completely to extending the elbow, which would be the same as straightening the knee. It's also true of the muscles on the opposite side. So if I turn this around, now we're facing forward. The biceps muscle is the same as the hamstrings. And so here, biceps, 2 heads, flexes the elbow joint and rotates it. Here the hamstrings flex the knee joint. So even the muscles are set up in a similar fashion. Another similarity between the shoulder and the hip is the deltoid muscles, which attach along the clavicle and the scapula and attach down here onto the humerus itself. And then the gluteals kind of match that. Basically, as a group, they're abductors, the deltoids also abductors. So if we continue with this comparison of muscles of the lower half of the body and the upper half of the body, we talked about the psoas, which is this very powerful hip flexor. What is the psoas of the upper body? Because everything seems to be quite equivalent, doesn't it? Well, I would say that things are not as clean and simple as they are in the lower half because the pelvis is so well stabilized. Instead, it's going to be a little bit more of a combination of muscles, but the strongest extensor of the shoulder joint, and keep in mind that extension at the shoulder joint, basically from this position to this position, matches flexion of the hip joint, which is like this. So if I do extension of the arm and flexion of the hip, they would meet each other. Let the names of the actual movement go, and just look at the similarities of this action and this action to one another. So the most powerful mover of the shoulder in this direction is the very large, broad latissimus muscle, which attaches here on the sacrum, onto the ilium, runs up this area called the thoracolumbar aponeurosis, out to the scapula, and then attaches onto the inside of the humerus here. It's matched very closely with another muscle that starts here on the bottom of the scapula and merges together, called the teres major muscle. The latissimus is known as the swimmer's muscle, and this is one of the biggest powerful movers of the arm, not only in this action, which is extension, but also in internal rotation of the humerus. And that's going to be important to keep in mind when we look at how we're going to lengthen this muscle relative to how we lengthened our psoas muscle. So the second part of the psoas of the upper body, I would say would be a muscle called serratus anterior. Serratus anterior attaches here on the ribs, and then it goes underneath the scapula and attaches on what's called the medial border, this edge that is closest to the spine. So the spine would be here, it attaches here, and then attaches onto the ribs. Now what makes this important are its movements. And what it does is it pulls the scapula forward, which is what we call protraction, and it also upwardly rotates the scapula. You think protraction and upward rotation. Basically, when you raise your arm over your head, you're doing both upward rotation and protraction at the same time. In this position, think about this relationship between torso and the upper arm. So here, this could be downward facing dog, for instance. Or if I bend my elbow, here's headstand upside down, or forearm balance upside down. Basically, any arm balance, back bend, downward dog, all of these basically bring about the same movement in the scapula. And it's to be encouraged because what we're after quite often, if we're not stabilizing, is getting into lengthening that long psoas muscle of the upper body, primarily latissimus and teres major. And the best way to do that, if it does this action, which is extension of the shoulder, we want to be able to flex our shoulder as much as possible. So if I'm laying in this position, then the shoulder joint is in the same position as the hip joint. So if I start to draw everything together, here's bending the elbow, bending the knee. You see how these mirror each other. And so here's a position where they're going to mirror each other once again. So when we did the back bend and stretched the hip flexors first, and then did the back bend, we would almost want to do the same thing here. So the same way I'm lengthening this section, I need to lengthen this section of the upper arm. We'll take a closer look at this when we move into the practical section. Let's go back to serratus anterior. This is a very important stabilizer of the scapula. And this is why I included it in the psoas of the upper arm. There's actually a condition that's associated with this particular muscle. It's known as winged scapula. And in winged scapula, if this is the rib cage, the medial border of the scapula here would actually lift itself off of the rib cage. And this would be at rest. This would not be when somebody is doing a particular movement or action. If you looked at them from behind, their scapula would be lifted off of their rib cage. And so this is almost always the result of a weakened serratus anterior muscle. So I'm going to put myself in a position where I'm going to get my scapulas to pop off of my rib cage. If you remember back to the first DVD, we talked about muscles doing their opposite action or working in reverse. And this is an example of this. And basically, my scapulas are going to stay in the same place, and what's going to happen is my rib cage or my torso is going to move away from my scapula. So there I'm letting my torso drop down. Here I'm picking my torso back up. You should notice that because my scapula is stabilized by my arms and my shoulders and into my hands, all I have to do is relax so that the torso actually moves in place. So quite often, we get the instruction to stick our scapulas to our rib cage. So that would be more or less this position. So look at the actual positioning of the arm. So I'm going to take that simple position. I'm going to bring my forearms down to the floor. And if you look at this position, the relationship between the humerus and my torso is like as if I were laying on my back. Here I would be in a back bend, or preparing for a back bend. And so I'm going to bring myself into a little downward dog. And I'm going to, I'm going to use my elbow. If I bend my elbow, notice how the wrist changes position. And also, the shoulder joint is going to have to change position. So I'm going to use that to my advantage. By bending my elbow slightly and bringing them towards each other, it's forcing me to bring my scapulas forward and upwardly rotate them. The shoulders are wide. The scapulas are forward and upwardly rotated. So I'm going to use my forearms on the floor and create a little bit of a back bending prep in a similar way as we created the back bending prep for our hip joint. And see if you can observe the similarity between the movement in the upper arm as we did the movement in the lower leg. So I'm going to bring my elbows a little bit closer than I would normally for forearm balance, add a little bit of outward rotation of the shoulder joint. Come up onto my toes, and I'm just going to start to bring my shoulders back and through. And by doing that, I'm forcing the scapula to come around, and as I push back, I'm putting the latissimus and teres major in a position where they're going to have to be stretched and lengthened maximally. If I start to set myself up for a simple arm balance like Bakasana, or crow position, I'm going to have to use and engage my serratus anterior to pin my scapula forward and up against my rib cage. If I don't do that, I'll be collapsing through my chest. So the same way I did this action of letting the scapulas go this way, I'm going to keep my scapulas pressed in this way when I go into the arm balance. I'll just set myself up. I'm not letting my chest sink. I'm making my chest lift so the scapulas are moving down and forward. My hands are going to act like my feet. They have arches in them. These are my toes. I want to feel the floor with my fingertips. And what I'm going to do is start to shift my center of gravity forward to the point where my knees come to my arms and then my feet lift off the floor. That's a simple example of stabilizing. The way in which serratus anterior stabilizes the scapula so these same tissues and muscles get used to lift me up and hold me in place. Let's look at the relationship of the entire arm relative to chaturanga, and we'll start with the wrist. There's a lot of debate of what is the right positioning for chaturanga. I would say, depending on the person, there will be a different right position. Those of us who look at aligning the joints or stacking the joints over one another sometimes doesn't quite work in chaturanga. And if I do stack my joints, I'll bring myself into chaturanga. With the elbow over the wrist, this is actually a stronger or greater angle of pressure on the wrist than this is. And the other thing that happens when your weight moves this far over your hands, you actually put more pressure and weight into your shoulders as well. The basics of that will be that the same way you have a center of gravity in your pelvis, in other positions, you almost have a secondary center of gravity between the shoulders. And so the closer your hand is relative to that line, the more efficient your tissues are going to work. The further back your hands are, then the more inefficient. The further forward this center of gravity is, and therefore the more weight borne by your shoulders. So let's also look at scapulas. And basically I'm going to shift my shoulders forward and back and squeeze them up and down. And in doing so, find the middle. Not too far forward, not too far back, not too far apart, not squeezed back too tightly. So often you want to find your middle ground. And sometimes it's good to find that by going to the other ends of range of motion. So here, shoulders dipping forward. This is basically elevation. Here they're pinned all the way back. And then I'll just let them shift forward slightly, so I'm not holding them as tightly. In the same way, I can round them forward, and I can let my scapulas squeeze. I want to find that middle ground between those two. And you'll find a place of relative comfort in this pose. Let's look at upward facing dog. There's definitely a relationship between hands and shoulders and the wrist getting caught up in the middle of that. But actually sometimes the problem is the distance between hands and feet. If you go from chaturanga into up dog and that distance is too short, your shoulders end up much too far in front of your fingertips, and as a result you put strain not only in your wrist but in your shoulder. So I'll give you an example of what we would not want to do. So if you look, if we drop the plumb line from my shoulders, they'd be sitting over the fronts of my fingertips. If you look at the angle of my wrist, it's more than 90 degrees. The compensation that many people do is either they change their feet into a position like this, or they squeeze their buttocks to shorten their back, and then they may also add throwing the head back to make themselves feel like they're in a deeper back bend. Now, none of this actually facilitates the balance between effort and surrender in the spine. So if I were going back to this position where I'm too short, my shoulder's too far forward, if I just pull myself back, readjust my feet, now my shoulders are more or less over my wrists. They can be a little bit in front of it. and my buttocks can relax more easily. My hands support my shoulders, and then I can try to back bend from higher up in my back as opposed to squeezing my buttocks to make it happen in the low back. Let's look a little bit more specifically at some of the scapular movements in upward facing dog, a little bit of do's and don'ts. There's also a tendency for people to squeeze their scapulas back behind them. Again, the body just sort of follows whatever the mind's intention is. So if your intention is back bend, it's going to try to make back bend from wherever it can. And so sometimes that shows up as a squeezing of the shoulder blades backwards. This can make it fairly difficult to breathe. And as well, it also can end up putting a little bit of extra strain in the front of the shoulder. So what we really want to do is we want to try to bring movement into our upper back. This isn't always easy. This might take a long time to actually create movement there, but you want to keep that in tension. And by doing so, you're distributing the back bend throughout the majority of your spine instead of only relying on your lower back to do the back bending.
In this sun salutation, if you watch my transition from chaturanga into upward facing dog, I'm actually going to round my thoracic spine in the opposite direction of the upward facing dog. By doing this, I'm going to be able to then follow the movement through neutral and into the back bend.
So when you see somebody with their shoulders up high, it's not that their scapulas actually have to move down. It's that the torso has to be lifted. And so this is an action of other muscles, partly serratus, as well as other muscles that have to lift the torso up around the scapula, not the opposite. So using what we learned in the downward dog, bending the elbows and bringing the arms in, most people don't connect that the arms in downward facing dog are the same as they are in back bending. So once I'm up in my little back bend, if I bend my elbows, squeeze them in, I'll even lift my head up a little bit, and then if I push through my feet, it's going to put a little bit more pressure through my shoulders, not in a pinching kind of way on the top, but instead it's going to stretch latissimus and teres major. Thank you once again for joining me in this second DVD. I hope I've triggered more questions and more thoughts and ideas, and also given you information that you can use practically either in your own practice or in your teaching. Look forward to seeing you in more DVDs as I continue to share the information that I've acquired over a large number of years and have applied it to my own teaching and my own practice. Namaste. Swasti prajabhya paripalayantam nyayena margena mahim mahishaha ko brahmanebhyaha shubhamastu nityam loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Om shanti shanti shanti.